untuk teman-teman maju lagi ke depan, pesan sponsor daripada Mari biar terlihat di video, kalian nggak pengen kelihatan di TV gitu, dadah-dadah sama mamah kalian di depan aja gitu. Jadi tolong, yang di belakang itu Mas Harir ya, Mas Harir IT disuruh ke depan. Nanti tolong ya temannya diingatkan kalau yang paling belakang itu nggak boleh diisi, jadi harus di depan semua. Okay, let's start our discussions today. Good morning, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi teman-teman semua dari kelas Ketenagakerjaan Hukum Ketenagakerjaan kelas E. Semoga sudah masuk semua dan IUP Labor Law kelas A, right? A, ya, suka kebalik-balik. Okay, good morning Miss Nabila Rizwa, Mas Susilo Andi, and also our speaker today, Dr. Petra Mehi. On behalf of committee, I would like to extend our gratitude, our warm welcome to our faculty, our gratitude for our speaker, Dr. Petra Mehi, senior lecturer from Monash University. And today we will discuss an interesting topic. It's kind of a research seminar. I also give you a apa namanya bahasa anak sekarang, spill apa yang akan didiskusikan hari ini gitu ya. So I hope that we will have a fruitful discussion for today, and today's event will be led by Miss Nabila Rizwa as moderator for today. So I will give it to Miss Nabila, the time for the voice. So the floor is yours, Miss Nabila.
Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Ini nggak ada yang mau ke depan beneran? Nggak bagus loh, nanti dilihatnya kita kayak ngomong sama, kalau di TV kelihatannya kayak ngomong sama kosong ya. Ini estetika. Actually have to, sorry. Yeah, that's the wrap up is better. Oke, sembari menempati tempat duduk, terima kasih banyak untuk teman-teman yang sudah hadir. This is our second guest lecture. Yeah, I forgot what's the terms. This is our second guest lecture for a labor law / hukum ketenagakerjaan class. So I hope you're happy to be here, like another new faces to talk with you. So it's not just me and Mbak Nailul and Mas Andi, but new things to talk about. So today, what I have with me today is Dr. Petra Mehi. She's an adjunct lecturer in the Monash University, and she will be talking about customary gift. Customary gift, what is that? What is that term? Like annual holiday bonuses. So basically about tunjangan hari raya, but a different kind of tunjangan hari raya in Indonesia and in other countries. Like she made a comparative study between several countries in Southeast Asia and how they regulate or make a customary over tunjangan hari raya in each country. So I think it will be very interesting. I'll give you the time for, I think it's around 30 minutes, 40 minutes to discuss, and then after that we can have question and answer. Okay, please. Here is fine, you can do wherever. But I think it's better here, yeah.
Can you hear me? There it is. Okay, well, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for the warm welcome to Fakultas Hukum Universitas Gadjah Mada. As noted, I have two professional roles at the moment. So I am an adjunct senior lecturer at Monash University in Australia. But for the last 8 months or so, I have also been working in the Republic of Palau, which is actually a neighboring country of Indonesia. It's north of Papua and east of the Philippines. It's a tiny little country in Oceania. And I've been working there as a kind of staff ahli for the vice president of Palau. So that's been a very interesting experience. But it's, so yes, I have two jobs at the moment, two hats that I wear, as you like. I also have quite a long history of visiting Indonesia, and back in 2002, I was actually a student here at Fakultas Hukum UGM. So it is very nice to be back, although it's really very different now. The buildings are all completely different, so I'm, a little lost when I walk around the campus, but it's very nice to be here. I can speak Indonesian, but I hear that you guys all speak very good English. So I'm going to present in English. If we really need to, we can switch to Indonesian later in the discussion. But yeah, my Indonesian is a bit rusty, but I can do it if I need to. All right, so today I have chosen to present a paper called Gifts or Wages, the legal and customary regulation of workers' holiday bonuses in Southeast Asia. And I will go back to the slides there. And this is a co-authored paper. So I need to acknowledge the contributions of my co-authors, Amanda Salvaraja, Carolyn Sutherland, and Trung Tran. They are my colleagues and former students at Monash University. So they have also contributed to the paper. This paper is work in progress. So we have a full draft available, but it's not yet published. So part of my hope of presenting to you today is that some of your feedback might be useful for us in finalizing, refining this paper for publication. So what I mean by workers' holiday bonuses are the annual bonuses, usually equivalent to a 13th month wage, so that extra month of pay for the year. And they are paid at the time of a particular country's major religious or cultural annual holiday. So you are most likely familiar with the Indonesian version of this, which is Tunjangan Hari Raya, THR. But I'm going to speak about not just Indonesia, but also the Philippines and Vietnam as a comparative study for this paper. This is a legal history paper. So we are interested in how these bonuses first emerged within the legal systems of these countries, how they have developed over time, and what they look like now, and what connections we can draw between the past and the present when we are discussing these annual holiday bonuses. And the paper is also at least partly socio-legal, because we are drawing on not just legal materials, so not just the text of the law, but also existing ethnographic material or anthropological studies that have been done in these three countries. Also other historical sources, newspapers, media coverage of disputes, and other kinds of information that we can draw together in order to put together that kind of jigsaw puzzle around how did these bonuses emerge and develop over time. So it's historical, and it's socio-legal, and it is comparative, because we are studying these bonuses in Southeast Asia. As I said, three countries, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Vietnam. Okay. That way? There we go. Okay, so the idea for this paper grew out of a larger research project that I have been engaged in for the last few years, which is on the formal and informal regulation of labor disputes in Southeast Asia. So for that particular bigger project, we've been investigating how the labor dispute resolution systems work in Indonesia, the Philippines, and in Vietnam. So that's the broader background for this particular paper. And we chose these three countries because they are the three most populous countries in Southeast Asia. I'm sure you know that. Indonesia has a very large population. And they do have a lot of differences, very different historical, legal system, and cultural backgrounds are very different across the countries. But they also share something in common, which is that their labour dispute resolution systems tend to be a little limited in their effectiveness. And I can draw your attention to the case of Vietnam in particular, where Vietnam has a labour law, a labour dispute resolution system on paper. It looks very nice. The ILO, the International Labour Organization, helped to write the law for it, but it has never been used in practice, ever, not once, not for any collective labour dispute in Vietnam. So that's a key kind of puzzle that we've been looking at in relation to the difference between Vietnam, Indonesia and the Philippines in how they deal with collective labour disputes in particular. So in Vietnam, it's wildcat strikes all the time. There is never any formal resolution of the disputes through the existing courts and mediator and arbitration type systems. So anyway, that's the background to the project. But while we were working on that larger research project, we noticed that these three countries share a peak labour disputing time of the year. And that tends to correlate with the time of that major religious or cultural holiday. So if it's Idul Fitri in Indonesia, Christmas in the Philippines, and Tet, which is the Lunar New Year in Vietnam. So in all three countries, we see this peak in labour disputes happening around that time, and it's because workers are disputing the amount or the payment of that annual holiday bonus that their employer has or has not provided to them. So we have this peak in labour disputes happening at one point of the year in each country. We also noticed some remarkable similarities between in the general form of these bonuses. So as I mentioned, it tends to take the form of a 13th month wage that is common across the different countries. But there are no international principles supporting this similarity. There is no ILO convention on wage bonuses. There are no transplants of law across countries occurring. There are no vestiges of European colonial law in this area. These are new post-colonial developments in all of these countries. These are not inherited in any way from the European systems that were in place previously. But the other thing that they have in common is that they are often the first to go. So the thing that employers are they most tend to ignore or deliberately not pay is these bonuses. So while the general wages may still be paid, in times of crisis, economic crisis, or difficulty in the business, it is these bonuses that tend to be dropped first. So you might have noticed this during COVID, during the COVID pandemic in Indonesia. There were quite a lot of disputes around the non-payment of Tunjangan Hari Raya in Indonesia during COVID. So we have a time of economic crisis, and we have a tendency of employers to drop the bonus first. So they might still provide other conditions, other requirements to workers, but they may not be paying that bonus. And that's the reason why we see this peak in disputing, in the numbers of disputes at that time of the year. The other thing that they have in common is that these bonuses are tied to patterns of migration. So we have, in all three countries, we have migrant workers from rural areas, often moving to work in factories or other employment in the cities. And then at the time of that holiday, they are really reliant on that bonus to pay for their trip home, their annual mudik, their annual trip back to their village. So we find this in common in Indonesia, the Philippines, and Vietnam as well. So we have this general similarity, but what we find that is different between the three countries is whether it is regulated through custom or if it is regulated through strong legal provisions. And so we were really motivated to investigate these similarities and differences around these bonuses across the three countries. All right, I'm going to be a little bit theoretical now for this particular slide. Hopefully you'll be able to follow along. But our broader project and this paper as well are framed by a concept of regulatory pluralism. So that's the term regulatory pluralism. And as Indonesian law students, Indonesian law scholars, you are no doubt familiar with the term legal pluralism, which is, I guess, the study of state law, hukum Islam, and hukum adat, all within the same system. So if we're interested in how those things interact, we are probably using the term legal pluralism. But what I'm using is a slightly different idea. This is more usually thought of as new legal pluralism. So we're not just concerned with the interactions between different legal standards, but we're also concerned with other kinds of regulatory influence. And that might be international law principles. It might also be private forms of business regulation, like industry standards or transnational business regulation. We are also interested in the idea of what actors are doing. So what are the people doing within these systems? What are the businesses doing? What's the state doing? What are the workers and their representatives? What kind of powers do they have? How are they influencing the regulatory outcomes within a particular space? So this concept of regulatory pluralism is quite complex. I'm trying to draw together a number of different components all at once. So we're interested in not just standards, but that is part of it, so not just legal standards, but also issues of compliance. How are businesses responding to the attempt to regulate their behaviour? We're also interested in strategies for enforcement, particularly what does the state do in order to try to enforce particular standards? So are they sending out inspectors to workplaces? Are they using forms of reputational sanctioning against employers usually? So naming and shaming particular employers is a type of regulatory enforcement approach, a different strategy. So regulation and regulatory pluralism is trying to pull all these different components together and to try to capture the interactions that are going on in relation to them. So it's a little bit different to legal pluralism, although it does share some similarities with it. It is admittedly a challenging concept to research empirically, to try to capture all those different forms of interactions. But for this paper, we found it is necessary to try to bring that full picture together in order to truly understand what is happening with annual holiday bonuses. All right. So in order to research this question, this is the approach that we have used. We have put together long-run histories for each country. So we have traced the origins and the development of the annual holiday bonus in the 3 places of interest. And in doing so, we have described both customary practices, so drawing on that ethnographic, anthropological type literature, social science literature, but also when and where legal formalities emerged in the particular countries. And also where we can possibly document it, the interactions between law and custom. The timescale that we are using is largely determined by each country's unique story. But generally we have been able to go back to the colonial era for each place and then trace the developments as the countries became independent and as their local legal systems were being developed. So we're interested in the unique story of each country, but in order to find points of comparison, we've also made sure that if we identify something interesting in one country, we've looked for it in the other countries as well. So for example, in the Philippines, the story of how domestic workers got the right to their annual holiday bonus is quite important. So to make sure that we've looked at it comparatively, we've checked What's the situation for domestic workers in Indonesia? What's the situation for domestic workers in Vietnam? So we've made sure that we have the comparison occurring across the paper. Our source material, as I've mentioned, we're drawing on state legislation and written rules and regulations. Also evidence of political context. That ethnographic material where it's available, so the anthropological, social science type studies that we've been able to bring together. We've also collected legal law cases from different eras, and sometimes we've been interested in the legal reasoning in those cases, but we're also using them as evidence of business practices from that particular era. So we could read a case from the 1950s, for example, in order to understand what the employment practices were like at that point in time. And because we're using that concept of regulatory pluralism, we've also paid attention to evidence of compliance, enforcement, and disputing behaviours, particularly in the most recent phase of regulation for each country. As I'll explain in a moment, the situation, the current situation is that two of the countries, Indonesia and the Philippines, do have legally mandated annual holiday bonuses. But in Vietnam, it is now only softly regulated by the state. So there is no strong legal standard in relation to this. So that's really the background. So I've gone through the inspiration for the study. I've spoken about the, I guess, conceptual framework, the theoretical framework that we're using. I've told you the method and the materials that we're using and how we've put that together comparatively. I'm now going to move to the next part of the presentation, which will be to give you a brief overview of the findings in the three different countries. So Indonesia, then the Philippines, and then Vietnam. We do have a lot of written material in our paper. It's very detailed. So what I'm going to give you is just the summaries and the highlights. So hopefully that will work. Yeah, so let's start with Indonesia. And I realize I'm speaking here to labor law students, so please excuse me if this is already very well known to you, although it's possible that maybe you don't have the long historical understanding of this issue. So in Indonesia, an annual holiday bonus equivalent to a 13th month wage is compulsorily payable to private sector workers. Although it is most strongly associated with the Islamic holiday of Eid al-Fitr, it is also in a multi-religious nation paid to, or supposed to be paid to, workers of other religions on their particular main holiday of the year. So Christians at Christmas, for example. The annual holiday bonus absolutely certainly has its origins as a custom of gift giving to workers. And we have a lot of evidence of this going back into Indonesian history. So there's historical and ethnographic evidence to support the idea, or to support the observation that employers have been giving workers gifts at Eid al-Fitr for a very long time indeed. It hasn't always been cash. So in the past, those gifts might have been new clothes, jewelry, cigarettes, whatever it might have been. And over time, we can see that in-kind gift giving has shifted into a cash bonus. So we can kind of trace the evolution of that practice. The bonus first began to be, the THR first began to be formalized in the 1950s. And this was through a union-led campaign. There's a picture on the slide here from a SOBSI demonstration. SOBSI was one of the first major unions in Indonesia. And here in the 1950s, they were demanding a hadiah lebaran. The terminology also changed over time from hadiah into tunjangan. So we can also trace the linguistic changes too. So it's formalized in the 1950s, and it was occurring through worker demands, through these kinds of demonstrations. But it was also formalized through labor tribunal decisions. I'm not sure how much you know about the old labor dispute resolution system of Indonesia, the P4D, P4P system, before the current, I don't know if you've covered it, maybe you did? Yeah. So this was the P4 system of the early era in Indonesia. And what the tribunals were doing was holding employers to either their own past practices. So if they had paid a bonus in the past, then the tribunal was saying, yes, hey, you employer, you have to keep paying this bonus to your workers. The tribunal was also making decisions based on precedent of other companies. So if a similar company had been paying a hadiah lebaran or a tunjangan hari raya, then the tribunal members were willing to say, well, hey, this company also has to do it. So this was like a process of formalization through court decision or through tribunal decisions occurring in the 1950s. Then the Indonesian government also started to put out annual recommendations to employers that they should also be paying a lebaran bonus to their workers. And initially, those annual reminders to employers, usually in the form of surat edaran, I think. By 1961, it became a direction to employers that they must pay the tunjangan hari raya. So it became, I guess 1961 is the key year when it really became formalized. And then we can move ahead a little in time to 1972, so early years of the New Order regime under President Suharto. And that regime, of course, was pro-foreign investment, pro-employers, and at that point they removed the compulsory bonus. And they said, let's just return to custom. Employers can do it or not, but the state is not going to make it compulsory. Skipping ahead again to 1994, probably before most of you were born, I guess. But 1994 was a year of major labor unrest in Indonesia, particularly in Medan. And in response to that labor unrest, the Indonesian government reinstated the requirement to pay a tunjangan hari raya. So there's a period between 1972 and 1994 where it was not compulsory. But actually, very interestingly, we can see evidence that employers nonetheless continued to pay a tunjangan hari raya to workers. And we could also see disputes around that issue during that period when it was not a formal requirement. So the situation really now is post-1994. There have been a few smallish amendments to the details of the law. You may be quite familiar with that. But in general, there is a requirement to provide the tunjangan hari raya. The penalties, if you speak to labor activists, they're probably going to say that they don't think it's very strong. The administrative sanctions that can be used against employers for non-compliance are not that scary. You can perhaps freeze the business for a while or threaten to take away their business license, but that's about it, really. There is maybe, if you're late paying, there's that 5% addition that you may need to pay to workers. But that's probably not that, it's not criminal sanctions. It is not very strong monetary fines that are in the law there. And when we look at the activities of Dinas Ketenagakerjaan, Kementerian Ketenagakerjaan, they tend to use a very softly kind of negotiated approach with employers. So they are quite reluctant to apply the administrative sanctions against employers when they don't pay the tunjangan hari raya. So labor activists will point that out. Thank you. All right, so the situation is Indonesia does have a legally mandated annual holiday bonus at the moment. There is some contradictory evidence around issues of compliance. In many sectors, the Tunjangan Hari Raya is paid as a matter of course, paid every year, no issues, no problems, it's fine. Usually that's the sectors like mining, very cashed up sectors that run on pretty good profits. They don't seem to worry too much about the payment of the bonus. In my own previous fieldwork, I was interested in the informal economy in Indonesia. I spoke to quite a lot of employers of small warung, small restaurants, pretty much no threat that they would ever be, that they ever need to enforce labour law against them, that the state's not going to pay much attention to them. But a lot of the employers that I spoke to said that they felt morally obligated to provide a Tunjangan Hari Raya to their workers, even though they, so it's the moral obligation that they were feeling. And it's quite widespread. Employers were telling me, yes, they pay it, they budget for it, they know it's their moral obligation. However, so that's on one side of the story. The other side is that almost every year, the Ministry of Manpower in Indonesia receives and responds to thousands of complaints from workers. 2022, there were almost 5,500 complaints of unpaid or late Tunjangan Hari Raya received across Indonesia. And there are also some non-government organizations, Indonesian Legal Aid, LBH Jakarta, LBH Surabaya, and so on, who also collect complaints and deal with them as well. So you can probably add those together to the overall number of, or the overall situation of non-compliance. As you may be aware, it's quite rare for disputes involving the Tunjangan Hari Raya to go through the Industrial Relations Court in Indonesia. Very, very rare. I've checked the directory of decisions, and I think I found 1 or 2 cases where a worker was disputing the payment of the annual holiday bonus to them. When we look at the dismissal cases more broadly, sometimes in a dismissal case, the worker will raise the fact that they weren't paid their Tunjangan Hari Raya properly, and they'll add that to the calculation that is owed to them after their dismissal. But issues on their own, individual disputes on their own, very, very rare. And of course that's logical, because if you're a worker, you expect to have a long-term working relationship with your employer. The fact that you might have been paid your THR late or a little less than needed, you are very unlikely to want to litigate individually on that issue. So I think that explains that particular phenomenon. That's individual disputes. When we look at collective disputes, we do sometimes find wildcat strikes in Indonesia, often public sepatu or garment manufacturing, businesses which have a small profit margin or a risky profit margin, and we often see that there are disputes relating to the non-payment or the late payment of the THR in these areas. And as mentioned earlier, this seems to increase in times of economic crisis. So during COVID-19, even if we look further back to Chrismon, to the Asian financial crisis, we find the same kind of pattern of disputing. What's quite interesting when we look at the media reports of these strikes is the language that the workers are using to explain their situation to the media. And what we find in Indonesia is that even though they are striking illegally, they are wildcat strikes, they are still making legal arguments about their requirement, their right to obtain a bonus each year. So the Indonesian workers who are being quoted in the media don't seem to be saying the employer has a moral obligation to pay it to me, no, or a customary obligation. They are drawing on the legal requirements. And that seems quite significant when we're interested in the difference between the legal and customary regulation of these bonuses. All right, next slide. All right, so that's Indonesia. I'm now going to switch the story to the Philippines. The Philippines, of course, is a Catholic-dominated country, a majority Catholic population, and so the main holiday of interest is Christmas. And similar to Indonesia, we also find quite a bit of historical and anthropological evidence to show that there has long been customary payments to workers at Christmas time in the Philippines. So to give you an example, the Benguet Corporation was the Philippines' first mining company. And we can see from their records that they first started paying a Christmas bonus in 1916. So actually at that time, the workers had to pay the company to run the company school, and the company decided that they would not require workers to pay that amount for that particular Christmas. And then from then on, the company started recognizing workers' contributions to the company, and this sort of custom or practice of having a Christmas bonus was put in place. There are also some very interesting Supreme Court cases from the 1950s in the Philippines, where, very similar to Indonesia, the court was imposing the requirement to pay a Christmas bonus on companies based either on their own past performance or on what other similar companies were doing. So a very similar kind of legal reasoning was happening in the Philippines at around the same time that it was happening in Indonesia, just in very different contexts, and of course this was for Christmas rather than for Eid, rather than for Eid al-Fitr. The story then skips ahead to 1975 in the Philippines, and this is when President Ferdinand Marcos was president of the Philippines. Dictator, military dictatorship kind of regime, quite similar to the Suharto regime in Indonesia. And this is, of course, the father of the current Marcos, President Marcos of the Philippines. So in December 1975, President Marcos announced a legal minimum employee requirement of a 13th month pay to be paid a week before Christmas. And that was announced in 1975, I guess, again, in the context of labor unrest. There'd been quite a few strikes. The labor groups were mobilizing against President Marcos at this time. The Catholic Church was also supporting that labor movement at the time. So we can see that this is probably a response by President Marcos to this workers' unrest, to give them something new, to give them a bonus, a placatory gesture to make them happier. This was his solution at the time. This was a rushed and not very well thought out decree at that time. And so over time, the Philippines legal system has had to adapt this initial announcement. And it's had to kind of clarify who is eligible for who is eligible for this 13th month pay, what kinds of workers, how is it going to be calculated, how is the basic wage used to calculate that final 13th month pay. Also, over time, we see that the idea has expanded. So initially, it was only for certain types of private sector workers, but now civil servants in the Philippines are also entitled to this 13th month pay, and also domestic workers as well. So the principle has expanded and become more complex over time. Unlike Indonesia, in the Philippines, there are no associated penalties for employers who fail to pay the 13th month wage for Christmas. So if they don't pay it, it just becomes a debt owed to the worker, and the worker can claim that debt through the normal labor dispute system, the mediation and so on that the Philippine state provides. So there are no penalties that employers face in the Philippines. But similar to Indonesia, there are many, many complaints from workers about non-payment or late payment of this 13th month pay. Those tend to be dealt with reasonably well through the labor dispute system in the Philippines, through mediation and so on. and employers will be held to that requirement that they must pay it. So that's, I guess, the story of where we're up to at the moment. So like Indonesia, the Philippines has a legally mandated 13th month wage to be paid at the time of its major holiday, which is Christmas. Next slide. Thank you. What we've been particularly interested in when we were studying the Philippines is trying to understand the ongoing interactions between that original custom and this newer legal requirement to pay a Christmas bonus. The first very interesting thing is that even though there is a compulsory 13th month pay in place, many employers still choose to pay a voluntary, additional, customary Christmas bonus. So it becomes almost a 14th month wage for those luckier workers. So the introduction of the compulsory 13th month wage did not displace entirely the custom of paying a Christmas bonus. So we've got this sort of interacting system happening, if you like. The other very interesting thing is that despite the 13th month pay being legally compulsory, there is evidence that workers themselves may still understand it as having customary or moral aspects. And we see this in times of crisis. So in the Philippines, like Indonesia, during COVID, there were lots of disputes arising around the non-payment of the Christmas bonus. And the calls for exemptions for employers got a lot stronger during the COVID-19 pandemic. It wasn't actually reduced, or exemptions weren't given in the end, but there was a lot of discussion around it in the media in the Philippines. The other thing we get a glimpse of is, I guess, community-led enforcement efforts, such as the campaign led by an NGO in the Philippines called Defend Jobs Philippines. And what they did was they held a TikTok dance challenge, whereby they had a Philippine rock band who actually have a song called Christmas Bonus. And they got workers to film themselves dancing to this TikTok dance choreography, where they're kind of capturing their, kind of sneaking up on their employer and dancing around the employer and saying, hey, employer, give me my Christmas bonus. You have this moral obligation, give it to me, I'm going to be very grateful. And there's hundreds and hundreds of these TikTok videos, which you can maybe Google and have a look for. But the very interesting thing is, it seems to be like it was the moral obligation that's being highlighted through these videos, not the legal requirement to pay the bonus. So again, we have this kind of interaction or these different understandings of what this bonus is kind of being displayed through these TikTok videos. So that's something interesting from the Philippines. Next slide, please. All right, so finally I turn to the third country of our study, which is Vietnam. In Vietnam, the main annual holiday is not religious per se, but it is the Lunar New Year. So it's tied to the lunar calendar, I guess the Chinese, Vietnamese lunar calendar. And the Lunar New Year in Vietnam is called Tet. So the bonus that we are interested in here is the Tet bonus. So it's not religious as such, but it is the major cultural, main cultural holiday that occurs in Vietnam every year. And like the other countries, it is the time of the year when gift giving is most usual. So between family members, between colleagues, and also from employer to worker. And we have records of examples of this kind of traditional gift giving occurring at this time of the year, going back into feudal Vietnam times, so back when Vietnam still had a king, and then also through the French colonial era as well in Vietnam. And we can kind of get glimpses of the emergence of the idea that that employers should pay workers a Tet bonus during that French colonial era. There's a few disputes that we can talk about in the paper, some other records that give us hints that this was emerging at that time. After that, in post-independence Vietnam, we can divide the development of the Tet bonus into 3 different periods. Generally speaking, the bonus became compulsory, but then it reverted to being voluntary, which is the current situation in Vietnam. So following independence in 1945, Vietnam, as you may know, started off with a socialist planned economy at that time. And through its regulations of the socialist planned economy, it started to introduce the idea that businesses should, so mainly the state-owned enterprises, should distribute annually their profits, a certain amount of their profits, to their workers. So this was a profit-sharing bonus in Vietnam. And it kind of emerged from that socialist idea that workers should be benefiting from their work. The regulations at the time were kind of patchy, not very clear, but we get the idea that they were paid at the time of the Lunar New Year. So that strong connection between the profit sharing and the time of the year emerged at that point. Then from 1986, Vietnam embarked on radical market economy-based reforms. So it started to radically shift from being socialist to being a capitalist economy. And that started in 1986. That was the Doi Moi reform era. And then Vietnam passed its first labor code in 1994, so a few years after the reform era started. And in that first labor code, a 1-month Tet bonus was made compulsory for all workers. There were slightly different requirements for workers in state-owned enterprises, for workers in foreign invested enterprises, and also workers in domestic businesses. But in general, there was this basic requirement to pay a Tet bonus. However, then from 2003, all formal regulation of the Tet bonuses was removed. And this was done so in a broader movement towards a market capitalist economy. And this is the situation now. So it was a kind of return to custom, return to union negotiated bonuses only. So Vietnam, I guess, becomes our comparison, our kind of outlier. It's quite a different situation to that of Indonesia and to the Philippines. Next slide, thanks. So what's happening with this? While no longer compulsory, actually the Vietnam government continues to regulate Tet bonuses through soft enforcement approaches. And mainly that means through requiring companies to report on whether or not they are paying a Tet bonus, and if they are paying it, how much are they paying their workers as a Tet bonus. So it's a reporting requirement that needs to be done annually. And then the media enthusiastically reports on those numbers each year. So you can read the Vietnamese media and see that they are kind of naming and shaming the companies that are not paying a good Tet bonus and talking up the companies that are paying their workers nicely. So this is, we can call this a soft regulatory approach rather than a basic legal requirement. And in the context of this, and I mentioned to you before, no collective labour dispute in Vietnam has ever been resolved through its formal labour dispute resolution system. This means that what we see is a lot of wildcat strikes in Vietnam around the time of the Lunar New Year. So workers suddenly get the idea, oh dear, our employer is not going to pay us a good Tet bonus, let's get out and strike. Those strikes then tend to be resolved through a special task force that the government puts together, an interagency task force, sends it out to the striking workers and tries to mediate a solution. So that tends to be the pattern of disputing around the Tet bonus in Vietnam. Because the bonus is not compulsory, these are of course interest disputes, not rights disputes. But when we read the media commentary in Vietnam, there tends to be a lot of misconceptions there that these are actually rights that the workers are fighting for. So we can see the fact that it used to be a formal requirement. It's not. But in workers' heads, they still think it's a legal right, and they go out and fight for it through wildcat strikes. So that's, I guess, the picture of what's happening in Vietnam. Next slide, please. All right, so that's the story or the highlights of the 3 countries that we have looked at. Now let me sum up with our comparative findings. At this stage, we've gathered a lot of detailed information for each country, a lot of historical sources, all those media reports and so on. And so at this time, we are looking for the comparative arguments that we can make about our research. This has been kind of tricky. It's, you know, there's a lot of detail and complexity to try to draw together in writing our paper. But we do have some working comparative findings as follows. So firstly, in all 3 countries, the payment of the workers' holiday bonuses has arisen from customs of gift giving and practices of holiday gift giving, both in the community generally and also between employers to employees. And here we are referencing that anthropological and historical sources that we have for each place. We can also maybe draw on some of the anthropological classical literature around gift giving, and I guess understanding that a gift often has reciprocal moral implications. So we can pay attention to that kind of practices and customs of reciprocity between employer and employee. Secondly, we note the trajectories of transforming custom into law have not been linear or straightforward. So both Indonesia and Vietnam have had periods where the state has removed legal entitlements and returned to custom. Those formalization processes in the beginning in Indonesia and in Philippines primarily involve both court decisions or tribunal activity, but also worker demands and protests against the state. So that's, yeah, and then, but when we see the fact that when it's taken away, when the state kind of returns to custom, in people's minds, they still think that they have a right, and they still continue to fight for that right past that time. We see some continued entanglements between law and custom through time in each of the countries. So certainly formalization does not divorce a principle from its broader customary understandings. And as mentioned, removing legal protections does not necessarily remove rights-based understandings either. So it is quite a complex story that we've put together for these movements between law and custom and back and forwards that's happened in each place. Fourthly, we also see that formalization does not guarantee an end to or a reduction in labour disputes. It may change the character of disputing behaviours and the kinds of arguments that are made, maybe a shift from rights to interests or interests to rights. And it may affect the way that workers make normative claims, but certainly having a legal right does not end the disputing behaviours. And finally, across the 3 countries, we also see these soft enforcement approaches being used, such as complaints handling, publishing of complaints data, naming and shaming of individual companies. And these are important parts of the overall space of regulation and the maintenance of normative understandings of the annual holiday bonuses in our 3 countries. Final slide, please. Yeah, thank you. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. I thank you very much for your attention. I hope you've found it of interest to you and maybe useful to your studies in labour law. Be very interested to hear your suggestions, recommendations, criticisms, other feedback, as this will be very useful as we finalize our paper for publication. And I'm also missing a few key resources on the Tunjangan Hari Raya, particularly from the new order period. So if anyone knows where I can find those, I'd also very much like to hear from you. All right, thank you so much. That's the end of the presentation.
So much, Helga. Shall we have a question and answer?
Q&A?
Yeah, but maybe you can
sit down for that. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think it's very interesting. Like, to be completely honest, it's when I'm hearing you, my personal point is that how something very that looks small in a bigger labor issue, because like I think none of us here are thinking to make a research about THR, like only THR. We usually make research about wages in general, but we don't actually only talk about THR. But listening to you, I felt like this small issue can actually show a bigger issues on labor, especially when you put it comparatively like that. For example, when you mention about how Indonesian workers, when they're asking for THR, they usually rely on more legal responsibility, while in Philippines they rely more on moral responsibility. I think that's a takeaway that can be very useful to be used in a different analysis on a different issues in labor, and how in Vietnam from 2003 there is no longer a legal obligation, but then the workers itself is actually still felt like they have the rights because it's customary. So erasing legal obligation doesn't necessarily erasing the rights in reality, because most of when it becomes custom, the workers will still think that I have a rights to do that. And I think that's a very interesting takeaway to make when we are, for example, looking at different rights that are erased after the job creation law, whether the workers itself still felt like, no, we actually have these rights, even though it's not specifically stated in the regulation. So thank you so much. I think like it's a very interesting takeaway. Like maybe we need to look more into those kind of entanglement between custom and legal in labor law, for example, specifically. So thank you for that. Now I'm opening the floor for question and answer. Any question? It doesn't have to be about this. Like if they have another question for you, is that okay?
I can try.
Any question? Door. Only silence. Yeah. It's not you, like, even though if it's me who's making a stuff in class, usually like 5 minutes silence, so we give them time. So maybe it doesn't have to be question, it can be a comment or anything that you feel interesting on the research, or any feedback. This is still finalized, right? It's not yet published.
Not quite, yeah.
That's
That's right.
So if you have any feedback?
Yeah, that would be great. We are finalizing it now for potential hopeful publication. So yeah, it's getting there. It's quite close.
But how you find the resource in for a historical source? Like how you rely on that usually?
I guess it's just being very dogged. Tracking down hints here and there. So sometimes we might find a paper that was written a while ago and it's got some footnotes that send us in a direction to follow up and find better information. But it's also knowing how to find legal case, the historical cases, even media resources, going to newspaper databases and checking to see if, doing searches for Tet bonus or Tunjangan Hari Raya, whatever it is we're looking for. And yeah, just putting together, it's like a big jigsaw puzzle, collecting all the little hints here and there, and then trying to, merge it all into an overall story that makes sense of what was going on.
Yeah. I can see how it's hard, how hard to do that. Even for just one country, it's hard.
Right.
Like, just to say like 3 different countries, it will be hard.
Luckily, my colleagues, one of them is a Vietnamese speaker, so of course she has managed the Vietnam part of the research. I've managed the Indonesian part, and 2 of the others have looked after the Philippines. So it's been a collaborative effort, exactly. And I think it wouldn't be possible without that collaboration, because I certainly don't speak Vietnamese and can't access that really interesting material from that country.
Another interesting thing that I don't know whether I get it right. So in the beginning of formalization of THR in Indonesia, you did mention that it started as a recommendation, as in like surat edaran and stuff, and then it become regulations.
I think before that, it emerged in the tribunal decisions. So disputes being brought to the Labour Tribunal, and the decisions of the members over time, more and more consistently, making employers pay it. And then, yeah, the Sukarno government started to put out the annual recommendations as well. So like the late 50s, those annual recommendations we can find being put out. And then they turned from being recommendatory to mandatory through that. And we still see that tradition of the surat edaran for every Tunjangan Hari Raya each year in Indonesia, even until now. There's something that makes the Ministry of Manpower have put out that letter each year. And it started in the 50s.
But when it started in the tribunal, it means that when the workers goes to the tribunal and ask for hadiah Hari Raya, actually there is no regulations on that.
Yes, exactly.
So they go to the tribunal based on the customary on holiday gift.
Yeah.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
But then during the tribunal era on giving it through the regulation, it means that the regulation are only given, the gift, the THR are only given to the companies that the workers goes to the tribunal. So it's not become like
In
general.
theory, yes, but if you look at what was happening in that era, even though in theory the decisions only affected the specific company in the dispute, it was actually in practice that those decisions were more broadly applied. So there's evidence of that in the 1950s in Indonesia, that's how the initial regulations were being developed. So they had broader effect, those decisions of the P4 pay in particular.
That's very interesting. Even though back then we don't have social media to broadcast
Right,
on that
right.
decision. Imagine now.
No
like,
TikTok back then.
Yeah. So even back then, that still have like some the viral impact. Viral impact. I think that's very interesting. I never actually thought that's the first time I heard that the tribunal is actually the starting point on that, because my own point of view is that it started as a soft recommendation. I know that part, but I never know that it's actually started from the tribunal, who workers goes to the tribunal even without prior regulation on that. So I think that also goes to shows the tension on the labor back then. I mean, like, to think that workers nowadays can go to PHI without actually having a legal basis on that, I cannot actually think
work.
of that. It wouldn't be happening right now, but to think that it happened in the 1950s, I think it's interesting to show how the tone of the labor back then.
But you also need to remember that at that period politically, the labor movement was quite strong in those early years of post-independence Indonesia. So the unions and the labor representatives had quite a lot of power or oomph behind their activities.
Yeah, I think that's what makes it interesting. So from smaller issues on THR, it can actually generate into like to see the bigger patterns on the historical pattern on how the labor regulations are made back then and nowadays. So yeah, very interesting. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to read that so then I can cite that into my other writing.
Thank you.
Again, a question or comment? Anyone? Yeah? And then after that, Mas Andi.
Okay, hello, my name is Nalia, and good morning. I would like to ask about, oh sorry, it's freezing. You mentioned that in Indonesia, they usually give THR as a moral obligation, right? And then I would like to ask, is there any significance impact for Christmas bonuses in the Philippines for the local companies too? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. So whether you actually see, so sorry, can I clarify like a little bit? So is it like in the Philippines?
In Indonesia.
Oh, in Indonesia.
They usually more give THR for moral obligation, even for the local companies, right?
Yes.
And then I would like to ask, what is the significance impact for Christmas bonuses for the local company in the Philippines?
Ah, okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's very similar in the sense that there is that strong moral or customary understanding that sits behind the legal requirement to pay the bonus. So both Indonesia and the Philippines have a legal requirement to pay that 13th month wage. So there are stronger sanctions in Indonesia, less strong in the Philippines, but in general it's a legal requirement. But we can see hints of that moral obligation sitting behind it. And it's similar in both countries, I think. Even though it's completely different religious contexts, completely different cultural context, somehow or another, it still has this similar understanding as a background. And as I mentioned, we can see that in those TikTok dances in the Philippines, where the workers are kind of demonstrating their moral or their background understanding of that moral obligation. Indonesia, I think it's most clearly seen in the informal economy. So in the businesses, the small businesses that have no fear that the government is ever going to intervene in their employment practices, they still tell me, at least in my research, that they feel a moral obligation to pay the Tunjangan Hari Raya. So that's the clearest place we can see that moral obligation sitting outside the legal requirements. So technically, yes, they should follow the law, but because it's small, medium-sized enterprises, they're not really very afraid of any enforcement.
But can I follow up a little bit on that? So do you also see the patterns when we're talking about those smaller companies or entities who don't actually fear the legal consequences? And they do it based on the moral obligation towards the workers. Are they actually still paying the THR the similar way? I mean, like 1 month and then before a certain period amount of time, or they pay but not exactly like the regulations are asking them to pay?
My sense is it is a little more flexible, that they don't necessarily have to follow the exact timing or maybe the exact calculations based on basic pay, etc. But the general idea that it should be a 1 month pay and it should be paid before Eid al-Fitr is really very strong. Yeah. So I actually did a lot of interviews with restaurant owners, employers in relation to that, small and medium warung and restaurant. And that's what those employers were telling me, and the workers backed that up with the same information. So employers said, yes, I feel a moral obligation, and workers said, yes, I expect it. So yeah, I think it's pretty well evidenced.
That's interesting. Do you have further question? No. No? Okay.
Thank you.
So the next question is from Mas Andi. You still want to ask questions?
Okay, good morning. I will ask you in bahasa. Okay. Penelitian yang dilakukan oleh Petra menarik. Ada beberapa hal yang ingin saya konfirmasi terkait dengan penelitiannya. Yang pertama adalah tadi Petra menyampaikan bahwa Petra melakukan penelitian di Indonesia. Pertanyaannya adalah sumber data yang digunakan dalam penelitian ini apakah hanya berdasarkan secondary data ataukah ada primary data, termasuk misalnya melakukan wawancara terhadap source person, itu yang pertama. Yang kedua, apa yang ingin dicari atau apa yang ingin dicari dalam artian ke depan dari penelitian ini. Artinya sebenarnya kan ini kan lebih banyak bicara mengenai sejarahnya THR di 3 negara ini. Kemudian dari penemuan ini kira-kira apa pembelajaran yang bisa diambil untuk kedepannya dalam konteks THR ini. Mungkin itu dulu, terima kasih.
Terima kasih atas pertanyaannya. I'm just going to answer in English because I'm lazy. The source of data that we use for the research was mostly secondary data. So historical sources, historical studies conducted by previous academics in different eras of time. So for example, we found some very interesting ethnographies of factory work in Indonesia. Some quite famous anthropologists who observed and spoke to workers in like the 1980s or different periods of time, and we can go through and check to see if there's any mention of payment of a holiday bonus. So it's actually quite detailed, checking through different sources. The only primary data, I guess, is kind of like complaints, quantitative data. So I did write to the Ministry of Manpower and ask for their data on Tunjangan Hari Raya complaints. So we have that. We put in a Freedom of Information request to obtain that data from them. It's a little sketchy, but it's kind of usable. And then my own primary interview-based research with restaurants was, I guess, a previous project, but I can draw on some of our findings for this one. Ke depan, pertanyaan kedua, ke depan. I guess I feel that we've kind of covered the issue of these workers' holiday bonuses for these 3 countries anyway. And Bu Nabila was asking me before, what about Malaysia? What about Thailand? What about some of the other countries that have this similar feature? And we haven't really investigated that yet. So maybe there's future possibilities there. We also know that some countries in Europe, some in South America, also have this similar annual holiday bonus. So who knows? Maybe we can find a way to go and have a look at that as well. But I think generally we have this broader project on collective labor dispute resolution, which we'll go back to. So we're still writing papers about how labor disputes are resolved, processed and resolved in these 3 countries as well. One of the other things I've been working on is a long-term legal history of the labor dispute system of Indonesia. So the emergence of the P4 system, its evolution into the PHI since Reformasi, and I guess some evaluation of how well that is working, some of the weak points that we know about that are kind of baked into the Indonesian system. That's another project that I'm working on, and hopefully we'll write up soon.
So you do mention that in Indonesia, you never actually found any labor dispute related to THR, and you thought that one of the reasons because of
only in the PHI, I mean.
In the PHI, because like they're still in the middle of the employment relationship, so they don't wanna they don't wanna jeopardize it. Yeah. And you also mentioned in Vietnam there is actually no labor process dispute in a.
It exists on paper.
But it's not.
And it looks very similar to Indonesia's as well. So there's mediation, there's arbitration, there's the court. It's the influence of the International Labour Organization, whereby you get a very similar looking system on paper between Indonesia and Vietnam. It's just that Vietnamese workers refuse to use it. Yeah.
But how about in Philippines? Like, do they have a labor dispute regarding this kind of issues? Because so you do mention there is no sanctions, right?
Right. In the Philippines, it becomes just a debt claim, like an unpaid, any type of unpaid wage or bonus claim is processed through the kind of individual dispute resolution system. The Philippines system actually looks a lot different. It developed more locally without the influence of the International Labour Organization, and so it's a little more complex. It's got different organizations depending on what kind of claim it is, and quite a big emphasis on mediation and kind of the SENA system, which is the single entry something SENA. It's an emphasis on mediation to kind of prevent disputes going through the more serious branches of the dispute system. Yeah. So it's just a monetary claim.
It's a monetary claim. Okay, that's another thing that's quite different in Philippines. Another questions or comment? You have a question.
Okay, Petra. So I'm just curious about when it comes to dispute between these countries, Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam. What do you think is more effective from the perspective of worker? Because as you already mentioned that in Indonesia, we have a formal procedure, we have a procedural law of the dispute, right? And when it comes to THR, it will be a dispute of rights. Meanwhile, in Vietnam, they don't have any imperative rules about THR, but they use, I don't know if I'm correct, shaming. You mentioned shaming in Vietnam, right? So which one is more effective? Because we in Indonesia now, we also have like, you know, netizen power, Indonesian netizen power, how Indonesian netizen can make any issues, any sensitive issues going viral, and it's also quite effective. We are infamous for that. And what's your view on this, or what's your team's view on this? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really great question that we've been discussing amongst ourselves. I think our paper probably won't go there. We won't try to say which is the better system. I think we're going to sit on the fence a little. You know, even though Indonesia has legal entitlements to the THR, we can still see that state enforcement, formal state enforcement, is quite weak. So, and attempts to use naming and shaming are still needed in Indonesia. Like, it's still an enforcement, still a way of getting those rights recognized. So when we look at it like that, actually the difference between Vietnam and Indonesia is not that strong. Like, they're both needing these softer kind of regulatory enforcement approaches. I think it would be a different story if the Indonesian Labour Inspectorate was really going out and making sure that the THR is paid and really putting penalties or sanctions against employers if they fail to do so, rather than using a kind of softly negotiated approach. I can see why maybe they're not doing that. You know, the continuance of the business is important. You don't want to put the business out of, you don't want to put somebody out of business, because then that worker loses their employment anyway, right? So you can see there's a dilemma that inspectorates face. But yeah, I think if that was the case, if there was stronger state enforcement, then you wouldn't be as reliant on those kind of softer reputational aspects. And I think it's reasonably similar when you look at the Philippines as well. You still have a lot of complaints, still have a lot of disputes, and still have this requirement for like TikTok dancers to try and enforce rights. So, you know, I think it's quite similar, even though we've got law in two countries and custom in the other one.
Very interesting. So even when in a country with a clearer regulation in Indonesia, when we're talking about enforcement, it's actually not really different with the countries who don't have regulations but only have custom, because our enforcement is basically customary. Yeah. Yeah, it's not really like a very strong enforcement because it is a regulation. So unless that one part is changing, probably there's not much different on having regulations or custom when it comes to stuff like this.
But as I mentioned, there's maybe some differences in the kinds of arguments that workers might use. So if there is a legal requirement, then they're more likely to use a legal argument and to say this is our rights. If there isn't a legal requirement, then maybe they're drawing more on the softer moral obligations in making their arguments. But you know, it just changes the character of the disputing, but not the fact that there's a dispute to start with. Yeah.
Okay. Any more questions or comment? Oh, one more. Okay. We're almost at time.
So I think my question doesn't have that much relation to your paper, but I'm just curious about one thing. You mentioned about how you seek to find differences among domestic workers in those three countries, and I'm kind of curious. Okay, sorry. I think I'll just repeat the question. So I think the question doesn't have that much correlation with your paper, but I'm curious about one thing. You mentioned that you seek to find differences among domestic workers in those three countries. And I'm just curious, like, do you manage to find any interesting or highly unexpected differences between those three countries? And is there any something that we should be concerned about or something we put more attention into among those differences? Thank you.
Great question, thank you.
You do mention that.
Yes.
And then you haven't.
I haven't told you what the answer is, have I? Well, the basic situation is that in Indonesia, domestic workers are not considered workers and therefore are not covered by the general labor law, right? So they do not have the right to the Tunjangan Hari Raya in Indonesia. Moral obligations may mean that they are given it anyway. Those of you who have a pembantu in your home, I'm sure you are probably providing a Tunjangan Hari Raya to them for Idul Fitri. It's very, very common practice in Indonesia. The situation in the Philippines is that previously they were excluded as well, similar, but the domestic worker movement in the Philippines has been quite strong, particularly through the Philippines' advocacy of the ILO Domestic Workers Convention. The Philippines was very strongly involved in the negotiation of that international treaty. And then once it came into force, the Philippines then passed its own local domestic worker act. And that Domestic Worker Act has formally given domestic workers in the Philippines the right to the 13th month pay Christmas bonus. So they have that formal right in the Philippines. In Vietnam, it's been much harder to get a proper picture of what goes on with domestic workers. Well, there's no general right anyway to a Tet bonus, so for anybody, whether they're a formal worker or not. But we've not really been able to find much evidence of household practices. So that's, I guess, our story across the three countries, and it seemed the difference between Indonesia and the Philippines seems to be the strength of the domestic worker movement. And that's the difference, but maybe Indonesia has not yet managed to pass its Undang-Undang Pekerja Rumah Tangga. It's just at draft stage, I believe. It's been at draft stage for a very long time. I guess the politics are just not quite in the same place as it's been in the Philippines.
But the wildcat strikes that you mentioned in Vietnam, have you ever seen any domestic workers involved in those kind of strikes?
We've not, no. The wildcat strikes tend to be factory workers. So we've not seen any collectives of domestic workers putting forward their demands politically. It doesn't seem to have emerged in quite the same way.
So in a way, it's stronger here if we compare it to
Yes,
Vietnam.
that's right.
Okay. Is it clear? Okay. So we are running out of time, so I'm afraid that we have to wrap it up. And I think there's no more questions anyway. And it's almost past lunchtime, so everyone is already like looking at the watch because the student usually have another class at 12.
Okay.
So we have to wrap it up now. Maybe you want to say something to close the session. Anything that you want to add?
Maybe I'll just add, I'm very open if you want to look me up and send me an email if you have some question that occurs to you later on. Very open to you doing that. I'm very easy to find online, so you can look my email address up and send me an email. Particularly if you have any, recommendations for what should be in our paper, that would also be great. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Petra. So now round of applause to Petra, and then we can close it up. Thank you so much. And shall we just close it? Yeah, okay, so now it's closed. Thank you so much. You can go back to your another class. So thank you so much for attending, and we'll see you again in the next guest lecture, maybe. I promise you, in the previous one, I promise you another guest lecture, and we have it now, so maybe next month we will have another one. So thank you so much, and I'll see you next time. Bye.